Today's daf, Be'ezras Hashem, is daf Pei Zion 87. And we're going to start from daf Pei Vav Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. We learned an interesting thing in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, I'm going to circle it on top of the page. There's a piece of meat called shriri. A shriri is a piece of meat on the Mizbeach that dried out. It's not yet ashes, but it's not meat anymore, right? So it's somewhere in between. So the Mishnah said that if it pops off the Mizbeach, if it just like somehow the fire threw it off the Mizbeach through pressure, then it depends when it happened. If it happened before midnight, then you return it back on the Mizbeach. If it happened after midnight, if it happened after midnight, then you don't have to return it back on the Mizbeach. Hi, Lewis, we just began. So we're talking about this piece of meat that there's a 12 o'clock time set where if it pops off the Mizbeach before midnight, you return it back onto the Mizbeach. And if it pops off after 12 o'clock, so even though it's a dried out piece of meat, you don't have to, we'll consider it as if it's ashes, and you don't have to return it back on the Mizbeach. So there's a chiddush that we consider it as if it was turned into ashes after midnight. So Itmar, here we go. We're going to start from 2 lines from the bottom of Daf Pei Vav Amud Beis. Itmar, it was taught. There's a machlokes. What happens? Pershu koidem chatzos. Let's say it popped off, this shriri popped off before, if this piece of meat, hi Sheldon, we just began. If this piece of meat that's called a dried out piece of meat popped off the Mizbeach, it's not ashes, but it's a dried out piece of meat. Parshu koidem chatzos, fell off the Mizbeach before midnight. So technically, what should you have done? Throw it back on the Mizbeach. But what you did was, v'hachziren achatzos, you put it back on the Mizbeach after midnight. So now, let's say it pops off again. So Rabba says, we go to Pei Zayin Amud Aleph, Chatzos Hasheni Akaltan. The next time that you will consider it as if it's turned into ashes, only on the next night, the midnight of the next night. So if it so happens to be on the Mizbeach and had not turned to ashes by midnight of the next night, and then it pops off the Mizbeach, you don't have to return it back. Obviously, if it turns into ashes, there's nothing to talk about. But if it stays intact and does not get turned into ashes until the midnight of the next night, and then pops off the Mizbeach, you don't have to return it back. Rav Chisda says the time is a little bit earlier. Amud Ashacha Oikaltam. We'll consider it by early, by the morning star. In other words, like by dawn, by Alois Shachar, we're going to consider it as if it's burnt, no matter what happens. So if it pops off the Mizbeach after Alois Shachar, then you don't have to return it. So Rav Chisda has an earlier time for it. Amrei Brei Rav. So they said, the yeshiva of Rav said, my Talmud Rav Chisda. What is the reason of Rav Chisda? That he gives a new zman called, instead of midnight, he called it 4 a.m. Why is it that? So he said like this, Chatzois is not such a usual time, because midnight has no ramifications anywhere else. Oma Chatzois, she'ein oisalina. Chatzois has no ramifications for Lina. Let's discuss what Lina is. When you shech the carbon during the daytime, you're supposed to put it on the Mizbeach. Let's say after nightfall, you didn't put it on the Mizbeach. We learned in the first Mishnah in Brachas, hekte chalavim ve'varim, you could throw the meat back onto the Mizbeach throughout the night. But if you didn't throw the meat on the Mizbeach throughout the night, and it's the morning star, it's Alois Shachar, it's too late. That carbon is possible. You cannot put it on the Mizbeach. That's called Lina. So that happens by Amoid HaShacha. That time period is Amoid HaShacha. But Chatzois, midnight, ain't oisa lina. There's no lina by midnight. If you forgot to put a piece of meat on the mizbeach, you could put it even after midnight. But midnight is oisa ikol. By certain dried out piece of meat, it could do the process of ikol, considering something as if it's totally turned to ashes. So Amoid Hashachar Sha'oiselina, the time of Amoid Hashachar, which has a process called lina, it could make something into lina, into a problem of lina. Ein din Sha'oiseikol, certainly Amoid Hashachar should be able to turn a meat into a consumed piece of meat. So basically, what the Gemara just gave the understanding of Rav Chizda is just like a logical kal v'chomer to say the concept that if this dried out piece of meat popped off the mizbeach before chatzos, and you put it back on after chatzos, in the morning, if it pops off again, you don't have to put it back on. Now the Brisa says, Pershu koidim chatzos, if you put it, if it popped off the mizbeach before chatzos, before midnight, the hechziran la'achar amud hashachar, and then you returned it after amud hashachar. So this dried out piece of meat popped off the mizbeach, so now it's on the floor, and then you waited till amud hashachar, and then you put it back on the mizbeach. So when's the next time if it pops off, I don't have to return it back on the mizbeach. So Rabba says, you wait for the midnight of the next day, and the next day we'll consider it as if the midnight of the next day, as if it's consumed. Rav Chizda says, Ein bohem ikol oilam. There's no way to consider it consumed unless it turns into ashes. But as long as it never turned into ashes, as if this piece of meat falls off the mizbeach, you continuously have to return it. So the question is like this. Now, the assumption is that this chatzos, when we consider this imaginary equal, we consider it as if consumed, is only if the meat happened to be on the mizbeach by midnight. How do you know that to be true? Maybe the Torah told you that chatzos is just a cutoff point. I don't care where the piece of meat is. If it's past midnight, we will consider that piece of meat, that dried meat, as if it's turned to ashes. So Maskiv la Rav Yosef said, asked the question, who told you the chatzos b'rosh mizbeach, the chatzos at the top of the mizbeach, mashva luhu ikol, that makes it consumed. Dilma, maybe kol heichel de mishkach kolahu mashva luhu ikol, wherever you're going to find a piece of meat, even if it's off the mizbeach, if it's past chatzos, you don't have to return it. In other words, what he's asking is, let's say this dried out piece of meat pops off the mizbeach before chatzos. So who says that after chatzos you still have to return it onto the mizbeach? Perhaps after chatzos, automatically we'll consider this piece of meat, this dried piece of meat, as if it's consumed. We're on Pei Zayin Amud Aleph. Sholchu mitam. They sent from Eretz Yisrael, Hilchas like Rav Yosef, the halachas like Rav Yosef. It menami, and that's true. Amar Rav Chia bar Abba said, Pershu kaidim chatzos. If this dried out piece of meat, now remember, we're not talking about a solid piece of meat that it's edible. It's dried out, but not yet ashes. Okay, so imagine it's unedible, but it's not ashes. So if this pops off the mizbeach before chatzos, the hachzirin achatz chatzos, and then you return it back on the mizbeach after chatzos. You didn't have to, but you did it anyway. So it's loy nehenin. You're not allowed to have a no from it. It's midrabanan. V'loy ma'alin. There's no me'ila on it because it's not kachim anymore. It's considered as if it's ashes. The chein tana bar kapora b'chor saying same idea. What's the same idea? Pershu koidim chatzos. If this piece of dried shriri fell off the mizbeach before midnight, ve'achziren la'achar chatzos, and then you returned it onto the mizbeach after midnight, yoytzim midei it's not really kachim anymore. You did a nice thing by turning it back onto the mizbeach, but really when the clock strikes 12, even if it's not on the Mizbeach, the Torah considers that dried piece of meat as if it's ashes. So that's what Rav Yosef says. So that really throws a question against Rav and Rav Chizda. How do they say that no, it's not? What are they arguing about? They cannot really argue against Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef made a lot of sense, and everybody seems to agree with them. Since in Eretz Yisrael they already said the halacha is like Rav Yosef, Rav Abba agreed with Rav Yosef, Bar Kapara agreed with Rav Yosef, Rabba Rav Chizda B'mai Pligi. What is Rabba and Rav Chizda arguing about? Amalei. So Abaya answered, Bishmenim. They're not really talking about a dried out piece of meat like a shriri. It's like a fatty piece of meat, a fatty somehow piece of meat. And there, it's hard to say that midnight we will consider it as if it's ashes. That is the machlokes. If somewhat it has a fatty piece of meat, and even if it gets hard, it's not considered as if it's consumed, because the fatness prevents it from becoming like ashes. So therefore, that was the machlokes between Rabba and Rav Chizda. Rabba said you wait till the next night, and Rav Chizda said by Alois Shachar we'll consider it consumed. Okay, new Gemara. There's a concept of lina. Again, if I shech the carbon and did not bring the meat on the mizbeach the entire night, right? Then I in the morning I can't just bring it onto the mizbeach. I missed the zman, right? What happens? I shechted the carbon and brought the meat, the raw meat, on top of the mizbeach, but I didn't put it into the fire. Is there lina there? The fact is, it's on top of the mizbeach, but on the other hand, it's not in the fire. So Boyamini Rava Merabba. Rava asked the question from Rabba. Lina moy eles b'roisha shel mizbeach. Does lina disqualify a piece of meat if that piece of meat is on the top of the mizbeach, albeit not on the fire? Or you did not. It does not disqualify as long as it's on top of the mizbeach. So the Gemara explains, hey Chidami, what's the scenario? If you didn't bring it off the mizbeach, of course you can put it into the fire. Because hashta, in the case lanu ba'azara, if it overnighted, lina means overnighted, on the Beis Hamikdash floor, and you so happen in the morning by accident you put her on top of the mizbeach, Amrit, you say de lo yerdu. That's what our Mishnah said, that if by accident you happen to put it on the mizbeach, you say, okay, leave it there, don't take it down. So b'roisha shel mizbeach, if it overnighted already on top of the mizbeach, mibaya, certainly you don't take it down, you burn it on the mizbeach. The ella, the question is the yardu. You brought it down. So the case is like this: you shechted a carbon, you brought the meat on top of the mizbeach and did not put it on the fire. The next morning, you discovered it. Oh, it wasn't on the fire. You brought it off the fire. You brought it down back onto the Beis Hamikdash floor. Can you bring it back up? Is this a pasula meat? Is it pasul because it overnighted? Is there overnight? Do you consider something a pasul of overnighting if it was overnighting on top of the mizbeach? Certainly, if it overnights on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, then that's pasolina. But this overnighted, and it was already on top of the mizbeach. So do you bring it up back up? So the question is the shulchan medamin law. The Tanan we learned in the Mishnah. Does it the things, the table on the shulchan, you had the lechem upon him and the bazichem, and we said the Mishnah says afila hein al shulchan yomim rabim ein bekach klum. There's no such a thing of the lina by the showbreads and by the incense there, the bazichem, the levina, because if it's on the shulchan for many days, it's on the holy vessel, so there's no problem with that, and therefore, if it's on top of the mizbeach, it's also no problem. Or do we say that no, just because it's on top of the mizbeach, it doesn't mean anything. It wasn't in the fire, and therefore we consider it as if it overnighted on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, and because of that, it has a psul lina. Amalei. So Rabbi answered, "Ain lina. There's no lina b'rosh shel mizbeach. Once it already made it to the top of the mizbeach, there's no psul lina." So the Gemara asks, "Kibla mina or loy? Did Rava accept Rabba's position or not?" Tashma, we're going to learn that Rava doesn't agree with that. The Itma we learned in a Brisa. The Itma we learned in a teaching. Avarim shalona ba'azara. Avarim, limbs that overnighted on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash. Makata v'hoylech kol halayla. That we know. That as long as it's still nighttime from the day that you shechted it, just bring it on to the Mizbeach, you have the entire night. Lon b'rosh shel Mizbeach. If it happened to be on top of the Mizbeach, it overnighted on top of the Mizbeach, and it's still there, you could still put it on the fire forever. Yardu, but if you brought it down in the morning to the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, after it overnighted on top of the Mizbeach, Rabba said, Yalo, bring it back up onto the Mizbeach because it doesn't have a psulina. Rava says, Lo Yalo. Rava disagrees. He says, it overnighted, I don't care if it was on top of the Mizbeach, it's puzzle. Once it came off the Mizbeach, don't bring it back up. Shma mina. So here we see loy kibla minei shma mina. So we see that Rava did not accept Rabba's answer, and he holds that there is no lina on top of the Mizbeach. There is lina on top of the Mizbeach. Now, Tana Rabbanim, Kshem Shem Mizbeach Makadesh, Tana Rabbanim, the rabbis taught. Hanageya b'Mizbeach, if it touches the Mizbeach, we learned. Okay, let's back into the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, let's say you have an animal that became tamei. Or let's say a korban, after you shechted it, you took the meat and brought it outside the Beis Hamikdash. So the Mishnah says, of course, that's a pasul of korban. What happens if a kohen didn't realize it and put it onto the Mizbeach? Once you put it in front of Hashem, so to speak, on the Mizbeach, the Mishnah says, leave it there. And the Mishnah says, not only if you put it on the Mizbeach, but even if you put it on the ramp, you leave it there. Not that you leave it there, but eventually you pick it up and bring it onto the fire. Because once it touches the Mizbeach, automatically it gets a Kedusha. Even though it was a pasul of korban, because you brought it out of the Beis Hamikdash, once it touches the Mizbeach, or it touches even the ramp of the Mizbeach, it becomes holy, and therefore you bring it onto the fire. How do you know that? Hanagei b'mizbeach, the Torah says, if it touches the mizbeach, it has holiness. Einu ele mizbeach. I only know if it touches the mizbeach, it has holiness. Kevesh minayim. How do you know if it touches the ramp? Kevesh minayim. Talmud loime es mizbeach. We marba even the parts of the mizbeach can make holy as soon as it touches something. Kli sharis minayim. How do you know if you put something in a holy vessel? A holy Beis Hamikdash vessel, it also gives a kedusha. Talmud loyme kol hanageya behem yikdash. Anything that comes into the holy vessel becomes holy. So now the question is like this: let's say you have a flower offering. And it became tamei, and you put it into a vessel, into a holy vessel. Basically, what you're saying is that as long as you don't put it into a holy vessel, you could redeem it and buy a different flour. But once it already landed into a holy vessel, so then it has a kedusha saguf because it became holy, it was in a holy vessel, and therefore you cannot redeem it. So Boy Minei Rish Lakish from Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish asked the question from Rabbi Yochanan: Kli shares ma'ush yakdishu es psulim. Does a kli shares make mincha that was tamei, let's say, does it make it holy? So that's a strange question. Amalei, so Rabbi Yochanan answered, Tinisua. We learned that. Even a holy vessel can make things kaddish, like the Mizbeach makes things kaddish. And once it landed into the holy vessel, you can't redeem it anymore. Amalei, so Rabbi Shlokish asked the question. Okay, that's not my question. My question is lechatchila likarv kamibayale. Can I bring? Once it landed into the holy vessel, you have tamei mincha that landed into a holy vessel. Now, can I chatchila bring that mincha onto the mizbeach? Is it is now so holy that I can, throw it onto the Mizbeach, even though it's Tameh? So Rabbi Yochanan said, Hanami Tanina, that we learned also in the Mishnah. We learned in the Mishnah, we go to Amid Beis, Shekiblu Pesulim Vizarku as Damai. That the Mishnah said that one of the psulim, that pasal a carbon. Let's say a Yisrael, or let's say a kohen that's an ovo, caught the blood, okay, and then caught the blood and sprinkled the blood on the mizbeach. That's a pasal a carbon. That's what the Mishnah says. So that means the kohen did both. He caught the blood and sprinkled it on the blood. But if it was a kohen ovel that just caught the blood, but a regular kohen sprinkled the blood, then the carbon would be kosher. It's only because he did both processes. So we see from there that once something was puzzle, if it's done by a kosher person, it has holiness and could still be brought onto the Mizbeach. That's what we're trying to say. My love, that story over there in the Mishnah is Shekiblu Psulim Vizarku Psulim. It's because a puzzle person, a puzzle kohen, caught the blood and sprinkled the blood. But if it was sprinkled by a kosher kohen, let's say the puzzle kohen that caught the blood handed it over to a kosher kohen, then it's it's a proper zrika, and you could lechatchila bring the limbs of the carbon, the averim, onto the mizbeach, even though it was caught by a bad kohen. But since it became holy in a vessel, you could actually sprinkle the blood lechatchila if you use a right kohen, and then bring the averim back on the mizbeach. So same thing by the mincha. By the mincha, even though it's a tamei mincha, if it ended up in a klisharis, you could be makar of it. That's what Rabbi Yochanan told Rosh Lakish. So Rosh Lakish said, no, you misread the Mishnah. Loi. Shekibli psulim inami shezarku psulim. The Mishnah is talking about two different cases. One, that psulim caught the blood, and another way to pass, so that passes the carbon, or another way to pass the carbon is even if a kosher person caught the blood, if it was sprinkled by a possible person, it's also possible. But even if the possible person just caught the blood, you still can't have a zrika done by a kosher person at all. So Rish Lakish disagreed with that. Even though it's a pasal a carbon, a pasal a mincha, and you put it into a klisharis, according to Rish Lakish, you cannot bring it lechatchila, you can't bring it onto the mizbeach. Now we're going to discuss in the last two minutes over here, just one concept over here, and then we'll get to the end and that's it. The concept is like this. We said that, let's say you have a pasal a carbon. Let's say a carbon that you took the meat after you shechted it outside the Beis Hamikdash. Now you brought it back into the Beis Hamikdash. Another kohen put it onto the mizbeach. So then, once it landed on the mizbeach, Hashem says, "Okay, just leave it there." But the question is, Avir hamizbeach kimizbeach domi oiloi. Let's say it did not land on the mizbeach. What happened was you hung the averim over the airspace of the mizbeach, and this pasal carbon. So is that also you leave it there, or airspace of the mizbeach is not as holy as the mizbeach? Again, if you touch the mizbeach, if the meat touches the mizbeach, Hashem says you have to leave it there. But what happens? The question is, what happens if it doesn't touch the mizbeach, but it's over the airspace of the mizbeach? Do you have to leave the meat there or not? So the Gemara tries to go back and forth on this idea. Tashma, we're going to do one raya, but Kashem Shamizbeach Mekadesh, Kach Kevesh Mekadesh. The Amret Avre Mizbeach Lav Kemizbeach Dami, Ave Kevesh Ken Lav Kevesh Dami. We'll just do one raya and then we'll stop. Basically, if you want to say that the airspace is not like the Mizbeach, then the airspace of the ramp is not like the ramp, correct? So, but the Mishnah said that if you put the meat on the ramp, then you have to leave it there and bring it on to the Mizbeach. But wait a second. When a guy is going to come and a kohen is going to come, pick it off the ramp and start walking it on top of the Mizbeach, if the airspace of the ramp is not like the ramp, it's as if you took it off the ramp. And we learned that once the puzzle carbon leaves the Mizbeach or the ramp, you don't put it back on. So how could you take it from the ramp onto the Mizbeach? As soon as you lift it up, you already talk it. That's Havale Yored. It's as if you took it off the Mizbeach. And therefore, how does the Mishnah say you continue to leave it on the Mizbeach? Answers the Gemara, the Nogidle. The Gemara says that our Mishnah is talking about that you don't lift it off the ramp. You actually schlep the meat off on the ramp, and you schlep it all the way on top of the Mizbeach. And then the Gemara discusses, but there's an airspace between the ramp and the Mizbeach, but we're not worried about that. And that will take us to the Mishnah, but the Gemara leaves this whole issue as not as a teku, but we'll just leave it over here as an unresolved question. The unresolvedness, if a man is holding the meat, that's even though it's in the airspace of the Mizbeach, the man on the Mizbeach and the meat, that's fine. But the question of the Gemara is, if you take like a fishing rod with this puzzle of meat and you push it on the airspace of the Mizbeach, does that airspace on top of the Mizbeach capture that puzzle of meat? And you have to, leave it on the Mizbeach, you have to lower it on the Mizbeach or not. And that the Gemara it leaves off as a teku. Okay. We'll stop there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Baruch, thank you.
I'm going to, tomorrow I'm going to send out a recording because I have a wedding tomorrow night.